This is a chance to hear about the organizations that touch so many in our community. The opinions expressed on Nonprofit Insider are not necessarily those of WMPG, its staff and underwriters, or of USM. Today we have Jim Phipps with us on Nonprofit Insider, and Jim is the executive director of the IRIS Network. Hi, Jim.
Hi, David. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Well, it's great having you. So, we're going to switch the question around a little bit, and I'm going to ask you to fill in a blank for me. You ready?
I'll do my best.
Okay. The IRIS Network is?
The IRIS Network is an organization that provides training for people who are visually impaired or blind so that they can maintain their independence and involvement in their communities across the state of Maine.
So, how many visually let's use the correct terminology. Is visually impaired the correct terminology?
Well, people who are not legally blind but don't see well are typically referred to as being visually impaired, and there's a big difference between legal blindness and normal eyesight. So that gap is sort of the realm of visual impairment, and the fact is too that being legally blind doesn't mean that you can't see anything.
Right.
So it's a blurry distinction at best.
So, just so we're speaking the same thing when we talk about visually impaired and legally blind, how many individuals in the state of Maine are affected?
Well, it's difficult to give you a really firm answer to that, but the best information we have is that somewhere in the neighborhood of 50,000 people throughout the state are visually impaired or blind.
And that's children and adults?
Yes.
And it's hard to get a handle on the numbers because of the rural nature of the state?
Well, the rural nature of the state, yes, and also the fact that there's no demographic. There's no way to really count it with any accuracy. It's self-reporting, and certainly, we serve a small fraction of that total population. Our work in visual rehabilitation is primarily aimed at people newly dealing with vision loss. And once they've gone through our rehabilitation program, they're off on their own. We don't have continuing services for folks. So we do maintain involvement with a lot of people around the state who are visually impaired or blind, but we certainly by no means have ongoing interactions with all of that population.
And before the show, when we were doing our sound checks, you had mentioned that the IRIS Network has offices in several areas. And what communities are those in?
They're small offices, but we have offices in Saco, Lewiston, Augusta, Rockland, Bangor, and Holton. Our headquarters is in Portland, where we've been for over 100 years. And we serve all of Cumberland County from our office in Portland. The other so-called field offices are pretty much one or two person operations.
Okay. You had mentioned something a little earlier that caught me by surprise. I had assumed that if someone got into the service network of the IRIS Network, that they would be with you longer term, but you said that your goal is to move them out of the service.
Absolutely. Our goal is to provide them with the adaptive skill training that they need to function completely independently. And once they've gone through our course of educational services and so on, and complete their goals for whatever, whether it's employment or independent living or what have you, once they've met their needs, then they're on their own. Now, if their vision changes, typically for the worse, they can come back and work with us again. But our goal is to accomplish that training and get out of their lives. Now, sometimes that takes a while,
Right.
but typically, and we do sponsor and coordinate support groups, peer support groups around the state. And in those peer support groups, sometimes our staff will have an ongoing relationship with the folks who are involved in those groups. But as far as our intensive vision rehabilitation programming, the goal is to provide the clients the skills they need to get on their own, and then we want them to be on their own.
And you came into this position kind of through the back door, and that's a compliment. I mean, but why don't you? Because I always find it fascinating how people become executive directors of agencies.
Well, prior to joining the Iris Network about 6.5 years ago as the executive director, I practiced law for over 20 years with a major firm here in Portland. And my area of practice was tax and business planning for nonprofit organizations. I also did we had a lot of healthcare clients, and so I did a lot of Medicare compliance work for those hospitals and other healthcare organizations. My primary pro bono activity, however, given the fact that I am blind myself, was to serve on the board at the Iris Network and be involved as a volunteer in a lot of their activities. And there came a point where they had recruited an executive director who stayed about a little over a year, and during that time I became chairman of the board. And while I wasn't directly responsible for recruiting the ED who left so quickly, I became responsible for recruiting the next ED. And I was rather outspoken about what qualities I thought the ED should have, and the rest of the board said, you should do this job. And I said, no, I've got a job. Not really looking for another one.
But he who speaks the loudest.
Yes, and it's if you're opinionated about things, sometimes it gets you in trouble. So
right.
At any rate, I said no. I really can't. First of all, you can't hire the chairman of the board to be the ED. That's not quite kosher. And then I said, but if you want me to think about it, I could resign.
Right. That's easy.
So they said, yeah, we want you to think about it. And I said,
and you resigned.
I resigned. And I took about a month to give it some serious thought, because I had certainly not only not thought about another job, but I had not thought about, leaving my legal career.
Right.
And so, needless to say, one thing led to the next, but I applied, and they did. I told them there were two conditions under which I would apply. One was that they would continue to do a national search, because I wanted the...
But you didn't tell them what country they had to do the search in. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Iris Network. Outside of funding sources, what do you see some of the changes that the Iris Network is going to have to make in the future to stay on top of the nonprofit world? And do you see other organizations doing those kind of changes?
Well, the nonprofit world is a challenging environment to live in. Basically, nonprofit organizations do those things that society would like government to do if government were to do all that society needed as far as providing public goods. And frankly, our society is a model of we think of free enterprise and the market as being the way that consumers' needs are met, but the nonprofit sector is similar to that. In other words, nonprofit organizations are organized to fill the gaps that exist in the market for public goods. And the Iris Network was formed in 1905 by a blind almanac salesman who traveled throughout the state and realized early in the 20th century that there were not sufficient jobs for people in Maine who were blind. And he went and talked to some of his friends, like Joshua Chamberlain and a few others, and got together a board and created a nonprofit organization to provide jobs for people in Maine who were blind at the time. And at the time, a job was the only social safety net that existed.
Right, right.
And now the organization has evolved over the last 100 years, 100 plus years, and we no longer provide direct employment for people who are blind, but we have evolved to provide skills training that starts with the kind of vision rehabilitation I mentioned earlier, and then evolves toward vocational training, so that once people have achieved the independent living skills that they need to meet personal needs, they can go on to vocational skills training so that they can work.
All right, so we're at the time of the show where I get to ask all my guests a trivia question.
Uh-oh.
And then we'll lead right into the midpoint identifier. And I do have to say, this week we have a two-part trivia question. Because I found the first question, I could not resist asking the second one. So the first part of the question is, the first person to receive a seeing eye dog was blank. Then the second question is, after they received the guide dog, they changed the guide dog's name to Buddy. What was the dog's original name? So I'll let you think about that for a second or two.
Well,
and Deb's sitting there back there nodding her head. How does he find these questions? So this is WMPG 90.9 and 90.4 FM, community radio of Southern Maine and Eastern New Hampshire. My name is David Unger, and we're on Nonprofit Insider. Today we have Jim Phipps, who's the executive director of the Iris Network. So, Jim, do we have an answer?
You could let me think all day, and I would not be able to come up with answers to those questions.
All right.
I do. The Buddy name sounds familiar, but I certainly have no idea of the original name, and I don't know of Buddy's master.
Okay, so Morris Frank was the first person to receive a seeing eye dog, and he had to travel to Switzerland to receive that. The dog he receives was named Kiss, but he changed the name to Buddy because he was embarrassed by the name. And that was according to funtrivia.com.
Is that why the Seeing Eye School is in Morristown, New Jersey?
You know what? I have no idea. But I'm guessing there might be a possibility. Next time you're on the show, I'll have that as the trivia question, okay? So, I'm doing some research and talking to some folks about the Iris Network. I understand you're having a program next week?
We have our annual White Cane Walk for Independence on Saturday the 18th. And we have a program the evening before
at
2
weeks,
USM, right? And we're going to present a documentary film called In Blind Sight at USM on Friday the 17th. And the film deals with accessible urban design and public access to transportation and other services in communities across the country. And there's a lot of issues around accessibility for people who use guide dogs and white canes, and the White Cane Walk for Independence really is intended to increase public awareness of the need for public access to travel for all citizens, including people who are blind and visually impaired. The documentary film, the Friday evening before the walk, really will go into some of the technicalities around urban design and city planning and so on that are necessary to make spaces, public spaces, available. I mean, we have all seen plenty of curb cuts and so on designed to make sidewalks and ramps for buildings to make them accessible to people in wheelchairs. But there are barriers for people who can't see the built environment as well, and the film will get into some of the details around that.
And did you have any involvement with this film?
I was shot, so to speak.
You were filmed.
Doing some traveling around Portland to demonstrate some of the some of the issues that are confronted by people who are blind. But the film was really done by a national expert in urban planning by the name of Claudia Folska, and she's from Denver, Colorado, and is a real expert. I am not on urban planning. She has 2 PhDs in the field, and she happens to herself be blind, but her background is in city planning, and that's.
How would you rate Portland's accessibility overall to a blind individual?
Well, putting it in its context as being the largest city in the state of Maine, Portland is as good as it gets. The public transit system in Portland is the best in Maine, and the city is reasonably well designed. I mean, as I say, Portland is as good as it gets. Now, with that said, Maine as a whole presents some real challenges.
So the state goes downhill outside of Portland.
Well, Maine was designed by folks who thought driving a car was the best way to do anything. And so once you get out of Portland and South Portland, Westbrook, and Falmouth, there really isn't. There's very limited public transit. Now there are. I don't want to say there is none, because actually I'm involved on a strategic planning committee with the Maine Department of Transportation right now, and the Maine DOT is working hard to improve public transit availability around the state. But as I said, Portland is as good as it gets, and there are a lot of places where public transit, for example, isn't available after 5 o'clock at night,
right,
or on weekends, which makes it very hard for people to, if the system shuts down at 5, you can't really get home from work, and if there's no system on the weekend, it's hard to do the dry cleaning and the grocery shopping if you have to rely on public transit.
Right.
So it's.
As I've mentioned several times with other guests, I'm doing a lot of work in the disability world in Maine, and these are variables that people don't sometimes grasp the depth of when someone has to rely on public transportation for everything. And at 5 o'clock, if the buses or the transportation shuts down, then an individual is basically homebound until the next morning, unless they can find a ride from somebody else.
Well, that's true. And one of the services the Iris Network provides is to teach our clients how to develop a transportation network of their own. So, it may very well rely on a neighbor or a member of a church congregation or someone else in the community to help with some of the going to
Right.
the grocery store or whatever it may happen to be.
So if someone who's not in the nonprofit world wanted to get into the nonprofit world as you did, what advice would you give them?
Oh, that's a tough one.
I didn't say they were all going to be easy questions.
I think you have to get into this work in a field where you really have a passion for the work. There has to be some. You don't do it for the money, because there isn't a lot of that, and you have to have your own motivation for wanting to do this work. And my particular story involved the fact that I had seen over the years that the services available in Maine, by and large, had much room for improvement, and I felt that
For the blind community or all disabilities?
well, in particular, blindness services, especially for children. I felt that the services in Maine were not as good as the services in other parts of the country, and consequently, that I viewed that as a big problem, and I decided, 6.5 years ago, that I wanted to try to get involved personally to help solve that problem.
That's great. So we got off track a little bit about some of the challenges that you see nonprofits having in the next few years. What would you think they would be based on your experience with the Iris Network?
Well, funding is a huge issue for nonprofits. I mentioned that.
But you have to have a really good development director, don't you?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
But even with a fantastic development director, people.
Michael Barndollar.
People think that fundraising is easy. You just write a grant, and people will send you a big check. And grants are a wonderful thing, but they're not as available as the lay people believe them to be.
Right. We'll just write a couple grants and we'll be all set.
Yeah, and we rely, for about 20% of our budget, we rely on philanthropy of all different sorts. We have an annual campaign. We work with major donors. And grants is one slice of that philanthropic pie. But the grant funders, especially with the economic downturn that we had in the economy 5 years ago or so, grant funders are being called upon to work with organizations to meet basic needs. And our organization, we're not feeding and housing and clothing people. So we go to grant makers and they say, well, shouldn't the government be providing rehabilitation for people who lose their vision? They provide rehabilitation for you if you get in a car accident and break your hip or something. Those folks aren't looking for grants. And we say, well, those folks have private insurance and Medicare available to help them pay the bills, and therefore the hospitals and clinics and rehabilitation services are adequately funded in a fee-for-service environment where insurance is there to foot the bill. And there's some issues around health reform, and we haven't solved all those problems, but by and large, hospitals and so on are working well economically. But vision rehabilitation services are not reimbursable by Medicare, which I think
kind of doesn't make sense, does it?
No, it really doesn't, since the average age of our client is about 78 years of age. Now, we do serve people across the whole age spectrum, but many of our clients are dealing with vision loss as a result of age-related eye diseases that ultimately cause blindness. And if you're lucky enough to live long enough, they say the chances are 1 in 3 that you're going to lose a significant amount of vision. But that's not necessarily what people imagine as their golden years.
Right. So if I were to tell you right now, we have 30 seconds left, and I'm going to give you the opportunity to ask our listeners for some money, how would you do that? You have 30 seconds left.
Okay. Well, every contribution is valuable to us and significantly important. We use donations from our annual campaign to underwrite about $100,000 worth of services per year, and those services are the services that no third-party payer is going to cover. They're the peer support groups and the real practical services that we can't get government to pay for. And so those private contributions make a huge difference between, running a full spectrum of services and just running the services where we can get reimbursed from, contracts and so on.
And if someone wanted to make a donation and then contact you, how would they do that?
They can visit our website at www.theiris.org, or they can certainly mail a contribution to the Iris Network at 189 Park Avenue, Portland, 04102.
Great. Do you have any questions for me?
I'm really curious about your work, the publicity you're doing to explain to people, what's behind the curtain in the nonprofit arena. It's a fabulous thing that you're doing, and
Thank you.
I just want to thank you for that work, because I think it's important for folks to understand that it's not an easy environment to work
No, and you said it's the work behind the curtain, like the Wizard of Oz.
in. Exactly.
Well, Jim, I want to thank you for being on the show today. It was very informative. Next week, we have the second in our series of gubernatorial interviews. Governor Paul LePage is scheduled to be with us live at 1 o'clock on Nonprofit Insider. The music appears courtesy of Michael Hubbard. You can find it on www.michaelhubbardmusic.com. Check out Mike's website to see where he's playing this weekend. Thanks to Deb Danger, NPI's executive engineer. You can catch Deb on Morning Street Fridays at 6:30. If you know of a nonprofit that should be on the show, please email me at npi@davidunger.net. And past shows are archived at www.tcmgr.com NP Insider tab. Until next week with Governor LePage.
Always chasing sunsets. Growing, growing, growing. I've grown too big for tourist towns. Yeah, I might leave a few friends behind, but these ways